接下来的2点10分至2点40分将进行本日下午第2场议程，其议程以英文进行。This meeting will run from 2:10 to 2:40. Now let's welcome our speaker, Ariel Fox. Ariel is going to share with us about the topic of mentoring designers in open source software, what I've learned mentoring and supporting designers in OSS. Ariel has been working as a designer for 11 years, working in for-profit and then moving into NGOs and open source software organizations, working on complex problems like sustainable food systems, peace building, and crisis response technology. Now please join me in welcoming our speaker, Ariel Fox.
Hello everyone. I'm here to talk briefly about mentoring in open source software from a design capacity and from a designer's point of view. You can access these slides and all the links within the slides through a noticed page where the link is on the screen at the moment, and you can get there going to noti.st/ERIOLFOX. To tell you a little bit more about myself before we launch into the conversations about mentoring, I'm Errol. My pronouns are they, them. I've been working in digital product design and the design sector and user experience sector for around 11 years now. And I've been working and volunteering for human rights organizations and non-governmental organizations for about 8 years. And I've been contributing and working for open source software projects and organizations for the last 4 years. I'm also now working on research that explores the relationship between designers and humanitarian or for good open source software projects and how designers participate in those projects. I've contributed to a lot of different open source projects in my time, namely Ushahidi, Mozilla, the Open Food Network, Mutual Aid World, the Linux Public Health, Open Source Design, Sustain Open Source Software, OSM, so Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, and lots more. So for the open source software projects watching, I want to make sure I cover this first, just in case you don't know. So designers want to participate in open source software. They want to participate in many different ways. They want to participate using their skills in visual design, writing documentation and structuring documentation better, so it's more readable and more usable, doing design strategy, working on user interfaces, working on user experience processes and flows, doing research into the users of open source software, conducting usability reports and usability tests, and then doing icons and logos and graphics and tons more. So designers want to contribute these things to open source software. So now that you know that designers want to do these things and want to contribute, but why? This might be the first time that you've heard designers wanting to contribute to open source software and what kinds of things they want to contribute, but why do they want to do this? The designers haven't historically been represented well in the open source software space. So designers really see in open source software a way that they can learn and grow and collaborate and communicate. So they see all the same benefits, if not more, that other people find in open source software. So people that code, people that write docs, all the different people that participate in open source software. Designers see the same benefits. So I asked members of the open source design community to comment on why they care about open source software and why they want to participate themselves. So you can find out more from other designers at opensourcedesign.net, but here are 2 comments from 2 designers from the community. Franklin, who is new to open source, says that designers have the opportunity to learn, grow, and collaborate with other designers when they participate in open source software. And this is actually very rare for early career designers that are just starting out. They don't tend to get to learn from other designers, and they don't get to collaborate on real life projects with other designers when they're just starting out. And even when they're advanced in their career, sometimes this isn't part of their jobs or part of the experience of being a designer. And this is especially true if those designers are self-taught. So other reasons why designers see or care about open source is that they see a space where they can openly center the humans that use the software within their work, within their contributions and within the tech. So Florian here is a designer who has been contributing to open source software for around a year now and is part of the mutual aid open source software design team. And they say that open source software is a part of our everyday lives, and it deserves the same treatment that non-open source software gets, which is a proper user-centered design process. So much open source software could really benefit from design support, and designers really want to offer this support, but there are so many barriers in place for them to participate. So this leads us into our topic that we're going to talk about, which is mentoring designers in open source software. And I regularly try to remove the barriers that these designers come up against when they try to participate in open source software, having been involved in open source software for a few years now. So I do this regularly within my open source software community participation. And these are a number of different things that I have been asked from different designers. These are only a few. So, can you review my article about design in open source software? So some designers writing articles about open source software and design. So they want somebody to review their writing about open source software. People have asked me, can we meet up and you tell me about design and open source software generally? So some designers just really want to understand what is open source software from a designer's perspective who's been working on it and been contributing for a few years. So they really want to understand generally what is the connection between design and open source software. Some designers have approached me saying, there's a project I'd really like to contribute to. I really love the project. They either use the software themselves, or they've heard about the project through other means or seen it be used. And they really want to contribute to it, but they're really not quite sure how to start. So a lot of designers approach me and say, how do I start contributing to this project? How do I talk to them? How do I make my first contribution? How do I learn more about the project? And these are great. And there's loads more on the screen at the moment of different things that designers have asked me when I've offered mentoring in open source software for designers. And I love these questions, and they're part of the reason that I speak about design and open source software so much, is so that I can help designers better understand open source software and open source software maintainers and coders and project creators about what designers think of open source software and how the two can become more involved together. But this is quite a lot for just me and just the number of designers out there doing active mentoring processes for new designers coming into open source software. So we have a numbers problem and we need more open source software design mentors. And the numbers problem from my perspective when I was thinking about this is that it's hard to find designers that have both experience in open source software, and it doesn't have to be lots of experience, but some experience in open source software, that also want to mentor, because mentoring is something that you choose to do and that you can be good at, that you can enjoy. And some people do enjoy that and some people don't enjoy that. So finding designers that share the aspect of having experience and wanting to mentor is really tricky. And choosing to mentor is not a decision that people take lightly, because mentoring is very, very different for each individual that you want to help, that you want to mentor. It's not something which you can usually give generic feedback and generic advice to. So it is a dedicated role that you often take, mentoring somebody for a period of time. But it's not just about having experience in open source software and wanting to mentor. Sometimes it's about also having the time and support from your workplace or your primary role. So people that don't have that kind of support in their day jobs or their primary role or the thing that takes up most of their time during their day, if they're not supported in giving mentoring to designers in an open source capacity, then they will struggle to find the time outside of their day-to-day. And there's also designers that don't have time, even if their workplaces did support it, they don't have time to mentor. So maybe they've got too much work on at their role, or maybe if their role doesn't support it, they don't have time outside of their role to support those kinds of things. So really, we've got a lot of different aspects that make it really, really tricky to find designers that are able to mentor other designers entering in the open source space. So not added here within this funny diagram about how difficult it is to find the unicorn of design mentoring in open source software is the effort that it sometimes takes to find an open source software project that is welcoming and ready to have a designer participate, and a designer that has not got that background knowledge in open source software either. So as a mentee, as a person entering open source software, as a mentor, you want to find a project that is very welcoming, that is very aware of what design can offer. So this is much easier. Finding these projects that are ready to receive design contributions and ready to talk about design and how it can benefit the open source software is much, much easier when you have a mentor to guide you through common information that you find in open source software, the history and the processes within open source software. Because sometimes it can be, and often actually, it can be very daunting to look up an open source project that you really want to contribute to, or to be looking for a project to contribute as a designer and really just not see the places where you can get that information, and not really necessarily understanding that information initially and not really knowing where to go to find the answers. But it's not just about numbers. It's not just about how difficult it is to find these design mentors with all these different aspects available to be able to do the mentoring. Open source software is diverse. There's so many different kinds of open source software out there, so many different kinds of projects, well-supported projects, projects that are running on a few different maintainers and contributions, projects which are catered towards developers, so they're about developer tools, or projects that are about non-developer users, so people that don't have, you know, a technical use of a tool, but it's more for regular sort of people out there. There's so many different kinds of open source software, and the mentoring that you give to designers, or the mentoring that you offer, can't really follow a set pathway. It can't be a cookie cutter process that you can just dish out to every single designer. It has to be somewhat unique for each project that the mentee designer wants to participate in. For example, when I think about this problem and when I'm mentoring other designers, I think about 3 different open source software projects that I have contributed to and work on. And each has a very different way to work on design, how much they know about design, and the team size, and the ability to receive open source software contributions for design. So we've got project number 1, which is very deep international UX research in UI and visual design. We've got another project which is mostly about user interface and user experience design and open source software and volunteer management. And then we've got project 3, which is about design advocacy, some UI and UX, and some visual and design quality assurance, or design QA, which is where a designer reviews coded pieces of interface, so give a review process. So these projects have some similarities, but they're very distinct in very, very unique ways. So they may share some commonality, but often they don't share enough commonality to be able to apply the same mentoring process to a new design contributor if they entered different projects, or if they entered more than one of these projects. And if I was working on each of these 3 projects, the way that I would mentor the designers would have to be slightly different for each project. And I think that this is particularly evident when I think about the different processes that the 3 projects that I'm thinking about here, the processes that they use, and how that is even complicated in itself. And I worked on these projects. So There are processes that some projects follow around how they do their delivery for the code and the development side of things. And maybe project 1 uses one process, and actually maybe project 2 has a different process but could benefit from some of the things in process from project number 1. And maybe project 3 has kind of 2 different processes that they use for delivery. And then maybe each of these projects has a particular way that they want to receive design, or maybe they've got no way that they want to receive design. And you can see, if you work across these 3 different projects as one of the designers and you know about open source software, you can think about how you can share processes across different projects. But when it comes to mentoring designers within each of these projects, it becomes increasingly complicated if different projects are using different processes. So this, what I'm trying to illustrate here is just the way that mentoring designers within open source generally is so specific to the type of open source project that you're mentoring for. So this is just about really explaining how complicated it is when you try to mentor designers generally within open source software. It really often has to be this one-to-one experience. It can't necessarily, or it's harder for it to be one-to-many as an experience with mentoring. Another common thing with the fact that we have fewer of these designers that share these different attributes that are ready to mentor other designers is that we burn out. We burn out really, really quickly because there are not very many of us and we need more. But there are lots of ways that we burn out, and these are some examples of how I've burned out on open source and design in the past, and just some of the topics that I've burned out on, so that it's made harder the mentoring process harder for me to do. So I've burnt out on design as a sector, as a profession, and talking about design processes. And I've burnt out on repeating the same information for different designers across different projects. And I've often got burnt out because I've muddled and confused different pieces of information across different projects. And I've burnt out generally on sharing, just being open all the time with the work that I'm doing is really an effort to do for designers, because the processes are a lot harder for us to participate in. And I've burnt out on open source software because the structures are different to a lot of the historic structures in design. So sometimes I've burnt out on open source. Planning is, you have to do so much planning in mentoring. So I've often burnt out on the effort and time to just plan for a really great mentoring and mentee experience. And I've definitely burnt out on speaking about this, and it's really hard to continue to speak on enthusiastically about a topic which is so under-resourced. So I just wanted to say some of the ways in which I've mentored designers in the past. So I've talked about the kinds of things that designers have asked me to help them with, but I'd like to give some examples about what I've actually done for designers and how I've mentored them. So I've kicked off discussions with open source software projects with that designer. So I've facilitated first meetings, I've facilitated different information sharing experiences, and I've facilitated discussion. I've also run workshops, so design workshops or discovery workshops, or something that is more related to a design piece of work. Facilitated those workshops alongside mentored designers. I've reviewed a lot of different designs that designers have wanted to contribute to open source software, so commented on them, given them feedback. Talked about how this could be received and how to present this back to the open source software project. I've chatted a lot about open source software history and experience that I've had personally within open source software projects, and kind of ways to navigate the social aspect of participating in open source software, or the communication aspect. I've contributed alongside a lot of these designers. So when they've wanted to create their first set of contributions, I've worked alongside them on my own issues for contributions so that they feel like they have a peer working along with them. I've suggested a lot of structures and processes that they could take to those open source software projects after they've kind of talked to me about the challenges that they've had trying to contribute. I've written a lot of issues and described a lot of issues that designers could then contribute to, helped submit PRs, edited lots of files, and formulated a lot of different research documentation for open source software projects with the mentored designers that I've worked with. So these are a number of ways that I have mentored and helped other designers with the contributions to open source software projects. So I want us to, as we finish up, to think about how we can improve mentoring in open source software for designers. And what are some ideas that can respond to this need of needing to improve the experience of mentoring designers in open source software for those mentees, those designers beginning to contribute, but also how we can make it more sustainable and easier for the designers wanting to mentor or already doing the mentoring process. And some ideas, there's a few here. Some of them, often all of them, actually have some flaws because each idea needs some kind of resource. But we could begin to think about this in terms of how we invest in the existing open source software designers mentoring and how they can do it as part of their role. So how can we talk to organizations that have designers on staff about helping those designers better participate in the open source software community and mentoring new designers coming into open source software? But how does that get funded, and for what period of time, and for what kinds of activities would be the questions that a lot of organizations would have. So we need to answer these questions before we can begin to present this idea. The next idea is about programs like Google Summer of Code and Outreachy, and even completely new fellowships and internships that focus on design contributions and supporting a mentoring process within the design contributions and design projects. So I would love to see more design projects being submitted through existing programs, but also completely new programs being considered and being funded for designers participating in open source software. But again, we need to think about who funds this and what kind of structures are needed for designers in open source software to make that a great experience for them. There's an idea about how mentees, after they've been mentored for a particular period of time, could then mentor themselves. So how do we, as mentors ourselves, set up others to be ready to mentor? So how do we increase the number of designers from one of the previous diagrams that feel ready to do mentoring themselves? So, but when does a mentee feel ready to mentor? And what if they really just don't want to ever do a mentoring process? And is this really an inclusive process? So these are, again, the questions that I want us to answer before we begin this idea. The last thing is about creating resources and documentation and recording how we do our mentoring in open source software. But honestly, when I do my mentoring processes, it's so time consuming and so difficult and so centered on the relationship that I have with the mentee that I often forget to document, I forget to record, and it's hard to then find the time to do the documentation process. So how do we allow the people currently mentoring or ready to mentor to document their experiences and their learnings really, really well so that other people can learn from those processes? So before I say goodbye, I just want to say that this is such a big topic and I'm completely out of time, but I'd really like to continue the conversation with those that are interested in an anonymous document. So there are some questions and prompts in the open document that has a link on the screen at the moment, and they're great for provoking thought and discussion around this topic. Please join in if you feel comfortable. The open document can be accessed at a bit.ly link, which is bit.ly/OSD-mentoring. So if you go http://bit.ly/OSD-mentoring, you should get access to that document. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening. You can find me on the internet at Errol Does Design on most places, including GitHub. Check me out there. And it was great being back at COSCUP again this year. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, Ariel Fox. Thanks for your informative sharing. Because our speaker seems like to confess to some technical problem, I'm sorry that the Q&A cannot help now. The audience if any audience have any questions, still can ask questions on Slido. Then we will let speaker know, maybe can answering those questions later. So We now may need to end up this meeting earlier. This meeting is over. Thank you. Let's take a short break right now. The next session will start at 2:50. 2:50. Thank you. 接下来进入中场休息时间，感谢讲者以及大家的参与。下一场议程将在2:50开始，谢谢大家。